Time to start.
Let's see. You can start.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might be joining us from. Welcome to the second Cardiovascular Health Tech Conference. This is sponsored by the IEEE Engineering and Medicine Biology Society Technical Committee on Cardiopulmonary Systems and Physiology-Based Engineering. My name is Thomas Held. I'm an associate professor of electrical and biomedical engineering at MIT, and I'm one of the past chairs of this technical committee, TC. I will be the conference MC, so I will be the traffic guide for the next 3 days. We're also pleased that the conference is co-sponsored by the IEEE Engineering and Medicine and Biology Society Technical Committee on Wearable Biomedical Sensors and Systems, as well as the IEEE SPS Technical Committee on Applied Signal Processing Systems. The cardiovascular health tech field has generated broad interest from technologists who want to create devices for unprecedented cardiovascular monitoring, to clinicians who want to figure out how to best use these devices to mitigate the burden of the #1 killer worldwide, to companies who want to disseminate the devices to many people, and to the end users who want to take ownership of their own health and their own healthcare data. Accordingly, the first Cardiovascular Health Tech Conference was the most popular online EMBS conference during the pandemic. In that conference, we covered cuffless blood pressure, sleep tracking, and atrial fibrillation screening. This year's conference comprises 3 two-hour sessions on 3 consecutive days, that's today, tomorrow, and on Friday, that cover cuffless blood pressure, the least mature of the 3 previous topics, congestive heart failure monitoring, and the future of cardiovascular health tech. We're pleased to announce that we have exceeded last year's registration numbers and have received interest from a wide range of academics, people in industry, and end users alike. These sessions are intended to be interactive with the audience, so please do submit questions via the Zoom Q&A chat option. Your questions can be directed to the speakers or to the session chairs. The session will also be recorded and made available via a private YouTube link that will be emailed to all registered participants soon. So let us begin with the topic of cuffless blood pressure, which is the topic today, and cuffless blood pressure measurement. And it is my pleasure to introduce our first session chair of the day, Professor Jinho Han. Dr. Han is an associate professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Maryland, where he is also a faculty fellow of the Robert Fischel Institute of Biomedical Devices and a member of the affiliate faculty in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics and their scientific computing program. Dr. Han leads the Laboratory for Control and Information Systems, focus in physiological systems monitoring, decision assist and closed-loop control for challenges in critical care, and resilient and context-aware medical cyber-physical systems. And Dr. Han will take us through the first session. Dr. Han, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for inviting me to share this exciting session. It is my great pleasure and honor to be part of this conference. So that said, in this first part of the conference today, we have 2 renowned speakers to represent industry and the academia perspectives on cuffless blood pressure monitoring. These talks by the speakers were prepared independently without any prior interactions on the content between the speakers. So it's going to be an exciting 2 talks. So let me first introduce the first speaker, Dr. Joseph Solla. So Dr. Solla is an early innovator and scientist on optical blood pressure technology, whose lifelong goal is to transform hypertension care and improve patient outcomes. With a PhD from world-renowned ETH Zurich, Dr. Solla spent 15 years at the Swiss Center for Electronics and Microtechnology to research and conduct clinical trials to advance blood pressure measurement and sensor technology, becoming a pioneer of the first ever cuffless blood pressure systems. So over this time period, he has released over 100 publications with more than 1,000 citations. He invented 14 patents, and he has been honored with multiple innovation and research awards, and has made appearances on Forbes, Euronews, and the other magazines, TV, and radio shows. So Dr. Sora is currently the CTO and the founder of Actia, a Swiss-US company commercializing the first ever 24/7 blood pressure product that can be purchased over the counter in the regulated markets. So that said, Dr. Sora, please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Zhao. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, do you happen to see my screen? Excellent. All right. So first of all, thanks a lot, Rama, and all the team that organized this meeting. That's very appreciated, and to the IEEE team behind this thing. So as said, I will be, from the 4 speakers, I will be the one representing the industry here. I will give, during these next 50 minutes, a very quick overview of what's going on the cuffless space and first feedback on the real world data that is getting from the first 1 to 2 years of these devices in the market. That being said, just some disclosures. So I'm founder and CTO of a company manufacturing cuffless blood pressure monitors. I'm also the editor of the handbook of cuffless blood pressure monitoring devices. And I'm also a member of the 2 or 3 different groups working on different standards for validation of cuffless devices. All right, so first of all, I think it's important to define cuffless BP is a very wild name. So just to make everyone to agree on what we are talking about here today, just taking this out from the handbook of cuffless, the definition of cuffless blood pressure devices are those devices that allow to measure blood pressure non-invasively without occluding an artery. So if you go to the book, what you will see, what this means is that we are not talking about invasive measurements. We are not talking about measurements that require a cuff to be inflated continuously or just at one single point. We're talking about devices and technologies that measure blood pressure or changes of blood pressure by using either optical sensors on the wrist, on the finger, on the face, or anything that's attached to the body without occluding the body every time that a measurement is to be performed. So that's the definition of cuffless. Now, when we started exploring this field about 20 years ago, and people like Rama were also there 20 years ago, that was a kind of a new thing, and no one was really bothering about this. By then, there was almost no academic activity, just some early people trying things. What has happened on the recent 5 to 10 years is just an explosion. So the academic activity and the amount of publications has just gone to very, very high. And this seems to be a very trendy academic field, which is cool. It means that a lot of people are putting efforts into that. That's from the academic. Now, talking about the industrial part of the cuffless BP, that's another story. So there are 2 types of industrial activity. And I want to make very different. Do you guys see my title, or you see the Zoom thing in there? So on the industrial side, there are 2 kinds of activities. There is a ton. There is a lot of industrial activity, what we call unregulated. So you can unfortunately buy today devices in the market which are not authorized. You can just go on Amazon and buy devices which have never gone through regulatory approval, which is very unfortunate. We are not talking about these devices here today. You can also find a lot of press releases and a lot of social media noise and announcements around cuffless things, which is not what we're talking here. You can also find a lot, and really a lot, of clinical studies, which are very interesting from an academic perspective. Clinical studies run on prototypes and run on algorithms, which are still under development, and they don't belong to a regulated device, which is already in the market. So all this academic activity is very important. All this unregulated industrial activity, it's dangerous, and we just want to make sure that we're not talking about this one today. What we're talking about is the regulated part of the market. So talking here about devices and companies that have a quality management system in place, that obtain regulatory approval in one of the markets. I will be talking here mainly about Europe and US. That obtaining regulatory approval on any of those markets that have a continuous loop of prospective and retrospective clinical trials assessing the benefits and the risks of those devices, and that have regulatory bodies coming to those companies inspecting that everything still makes sense after being in market. That's the companies that I'm representing here today on the industrial activity of Cuffless BP. And there are not a lot of them. So we can cluster them into groups. Those devices that are mainly used for prescription-based approaches, mostly in clinic, but not only. There is one in Germany, there is one in the US, and there are two in Israel. That's from the best that we know, the only devices that are today in a regulated market, already in the market. And then there are also the devices that are regulated and approved to be in different markets, which can be used at home and can be just purchased by the users or the patients themselves. There is one in Switzerland, coming from Switzerland, and one coming from Korea. So to the best of our knowledge, I've been going through my network these last days. These are the only devices which are in the market, which are purely cuffless and that can be found because they have been approved, authorized. Now, what I'm going to focus now is to show you very cool data on how these devices, in particular these over-the-counter home use devices, can be used in the fight against hypertension, which is our preferred topic. So why do we actually need these devices in the management of hypertension? Mainly, you all know hypertension is a very big problem. That's fine. You know it. I don't need to go through the numbers. It's a lot of people affected, a lot of comorbidities, and a lot of healthcare costs. The scary part of it is that the control of hypertension is not even stable. It's just decreasing. So we have more and more patients in proportion which are getting hypertensive and who cannot manage their hypertension. And that's the scary part. And that's the goal of my discussion today. That's where the cuffless devices can really provide value. So why do we think that cuffless blood pressure regulated devices can help to improve the management and the control of hypertension? That's what we call the virtuous cycle of cuffless blood pressure. So everything starts by the fact that a cuffless device, by definition, will be easy to be used. So I will show them data from patients. People, they prefer to wear a cuffless device than to wear a cuff. So we'll have an improved experience of the monitoring part. What this will create is that the preference of the device will be higher and the adherence will be higher. So patients will be wearing more often. They will be persistently wearing those devices. They will persistently generating new data. So we will now go from one measurement every month or one every week to a kind of more continuous data set of blood pressure. So this will come to the patient, and this can also go to the physician. What will happen is that the patient will be more aware about his or her blood pressure and will becomes to be more engaged. And the physician will be able also to do something in there. By improving that engagement of the patient, and that's a very important part of hypertension care that has been kind of put aside for a long term. By improving that engagement, we will get to an improved BP control. I will show data on this afterwards. And this improved BP control, so we'll have those patients being out there with their blood pressure under control. That's what will create an improved clinical outcome. And because of that, we are just closing the loop. So the fact that cuffless devices have the unique advantage to be easier to be used on the long term, and hypertension is not about 1 week. Hypertension is about all your life. So you need to have a device with you that you want to wear for the rest of your life to keep this blood pressure under control. So that's the hypothesis behind cuffless blood pressure devices. We do believe, as the industrials, that by having these easier devices, we will help at managing hypertension in this way. Now, what data do we have? What do we actually know about, is this true or is it just blah, blah? I will now compare how these cuffless devices in the market compare to HBPM, which is the home blood pressure monitoring, or the ABPM, the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, in terms of patient preference. So the results are very, very clear. This is from clinical trials where we have patients wearing for several months these cuffless devices, and having an HBPM monitoring program in place. So they need to measure once a day or once every 2 days. The results are just very clear. So 93% of the patients, they prefer to wear a cuffless device, and none of them prefer to have the cuff device. Similarly, we have also clinical trials where we ask to those patients after 6 months of monitoring, do you prefer to wear an ABPM or a cuffless device? And the results are just very strikingly clear, is that they find the cuffless device is more comfortable, and they are more willing to wear the cuffless device instead of an ABPM. Not saying that an ABPM is not useful, just saying that patients, for the long term, they prefer to wear a cuffless device than an HBPM or an ABPM. So the next question is, how much are you willing to be measuring your blood pressure? The big problem today with blood pressure is not that it cannot be measured. It can be measured using a cuff. The problem is that it's not being measured. So we have devices, we have cuffs, but people, those patients, they just don't use it. What I'm showing here is statistics from the US, where you see that less than 15-20% of the patients, they measure their blood pressure monthly or weekly. And it's not that there is no oscillometric device out there in the US market. The devices that are there, most of them, they are at the houses of the patients. They just don't use it. When you look at the cuffless device space, and this is data from our own device, after 6 to 12 months of having the device, more than 50% of the patients, they are still measuring their blood pressure almost weekly. So we have a clearly improved adherence of the patients that want to use those devices, but they will probably not use the oscillometric device. This, by having this device being worn consistently, will generate more data. We have been publishing a lot on this. This is a time series of about 6 months of data of one of our users. I don't know, it is completely anonymous. Each small dot is one single data point coming from our devices. The upper orange line is the daytime BP, systolic BP of that user, and the bottom black line is the nighttime BP of that user. So now we start seeing long-term trends of BP during the day and during the night. So now we can generate continuously time in target range metrics, and we can continuously generate at different periods in time, different circadian cycles on how much the blood pressure is high or low during the night. That's something that before a system that was worn by the user persistently was just not doable. Now we expose the users to the data. What would happen? So now, because those users, we know that they will be wearing those devices for the long term, they can set their goals. They can say, I want to have my systolic lower than 135, or the physician will tell this to them. So they can set the goals, they can keep tracking those goals easily. The highlighting work here is easily. And then when we see trends happening on this systolic blood pressures, we can tell, okay, whatever you did, you stopped probably alcohol, or just started changing your diet, or you went to the physician, medication was changed, or anything. Now we can see the trends, and we can give a real-time feedback to the user on saying, that's good for you, that's not good for you. And that's the way engagement increases. On the same side, on the physician side of things, now those physicians, they have this remote monitoring of the patients day by day, not even seeing them, where they can literally score the patients to which ones are under control, which ones are not under control, and just go and call and give back to the office those that need to be put under better control. When we go to engagement, and that's a very cool one. So I don't know how much you know that people are measuring blood pressure. So these retention curves from our own device. So people, they are buying those cuffless devices, they start wearing it. On the first days, what you see here is the amount of times per day that a user is looking at the data. So these people, they buy a cuffless device, and on the first days, they come about 6 to 7 to up to 9 times per day to see their blood pressure. That's the way they become aware about their blood pressure. This will never happen with a cuff. No one will be willing to measure with a cuff 10 times the first day they buy the cuff. This, of course, just goes down, as it should be. And after 6 months, what we see that, in average, people, they come every 2 days to see their blood pressure data, which is huge. You will never see this with any previous blood pressure monitor in the world. So these cuffless devices do have the power to engage patients. And this one is even cooler. So this is daytime activity that we see on our servers from last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago. So every cycle that you see is 1 day. So what happens here, literally, when those users and patients, they wake up, the first thing they do, that's a spike you see. They're going from the bed to the toilet, they go to their app, and they see the blood pressure. They want to see how their blood pressure did the day before or during the night. I'm sure that no one is waking up in the morning and the first thing he wants to do is to look at his blood pressure with a cuff. During the day, they will kind of be lower on the activity, and before going to bed, they will again, oh, let's see how my blood pressure was today. This is the time of engagement that only cuffless devices can achieve. Now,
sorry, but you have 1 more minute to go.
Okay, so mainly what we're saying here, I will pass that on that one. The thing is that we have a lot of things that have been developed. We have these devices now out there in the market. Not a lot of them, they are regulated. Those that are regulated, they do deserve to have a lot of clinical exploration. We know that these devices will engage patients. We know that these devices will help patients. So what we need is to have better clinical research. So just to finalize, auscultation is there since 1 century, and it allowed to have office blood pressure measurements, which was a huge first step. Then we got the HBPMs, which provide the different data, but allowed to have home blood pressure monitoring. Then we got the ABPM, which was completely different than HBPM and auscultation, and allowed to have a very punctual measurement of blood pressure everywhere. Now, our vision is that these cuffless devices coming here, they provide different information than ABPM and HBPMs and auscultation, but they have the unique advantage that will engage the patients in a way that none of the others have ever done. So to finalize, I will just stop with this one, is that the initial data that we're getting from these devices in the real world are showing that they have the ability to improve the control of hypertension across large population, mainly, and that's the biggest advantage, because they can empower and engage patients in a way that the previous non-cuffless devices could never do. So that's all from my side. I had 2 appendices, which are 2 minutes. I don't know, Jano, if you want me to go through or not. Okay, right. So that's the end of my talk. I just took the opportunity also to answer here some criticism or questions that we regularly have on the cuffless space. So we tend to hear a lot the criticism of saying, yeah, but a cuffless blood pressure monitor will never be is as accurate as a naive device. A naive device meaning that a device that is just giving always the same blood pressure. So let me show you this data. What you see here is data from not 1 subject, not 100 subjects. It's data from 2,000 subjects. So talking here about 10,000 BP readings. On the horizontal axis, you have blood pressure measured by subjects themselves at home. On the vertical axis, you have what would do a naive device. So a device that assumes I see this patient on day 1, and I assume that his blood pressure is constant for the next, this is almost 1 year of follow-up. So what we see here on the different colors is how well we are classifying the patients to be at different stages of hypertension. So by having a naive device, this is just a big potato. It's just a big bubble. Now, if instead of having a naive device, we use a cuffless device that was calibrated once at the beginning and just following a blood pressure for 6 months to 1 year, this becomes a real scatter plot. We start tracking the blood pressure. And talking about tracking, that's the other one. We also get a lot the criticism that, yeah, but cuffless devices will never track blood pressure in the real world. They do not track. Well, we have data from a lot of subjects. So there is not 3 subjects in a clinical setting. One, this is data from 2,000 subjects, talking here about 25,000 blood pressure changes. What you see on the right side is the BP changes seen by self-measured HBPM changes of blood pressure. What you see on the vertical side is changes seen by the cuffless devices. So the data that we have, the cuffless device manufacturers, shows that in this case, for 25,000 BP changes, 90% of the time, a cuff, which is out there in the market, and the cuffless devices agree on changes of blood pressure seen in the real world. And the final criticism is that, yeah, but this will only work on young, healthy people with very non-stiff arteries. So that's wrong. So that's the data that we have, exactly the same patients than before. When you look at the tracking capability on younger, which is on the left side, we have 91% of concordance rate between an HBPM and a cuffless device. When you look at the elderly population on the right side, we have 89% of concordance rate. So these are the kind of things that we are exploring. We, the cuffless device manufacturers, we start to have a lot of data. And I think I will stop here with the call that there is a lot to be done here. We're just opening a new chapter in the monitoring of blood pressure for hypertension management. And we just need the forces and the help of everyone to help using these and deploying this at a large scale. And I will pause there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the excellent talk. Now let me introduce our second speaker. Dr. Ramakrishna Mukamala is a professor of bioengineering and anesthesiology and perioperative medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. He has investigated cuffless blood pressure for more than a decade. His efforts in this field include developing new measurement methods and devices, investigating popular methods, establishing validation standards, and disseminating knowledge through reviews, editorials, and book chapters. Professor Mukamala's cuffless blood pressure research has received publication and innovation awards and worldwide media attention, including from the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and Medscape. With that, Professor Mukamala, please go ahead.
Can you hear me and see?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Han. I enjoyed Dr. Sola's talk very much, but I'm going to give an opposing state of the field address on cuffless blood pressure. Before I begin, I should mention that I have licensed patents on cuffless blood pressure technology that is different from the methods that I will focus on today. So it's long been known that hypertension is a major cardiovascular risk factor that is treatable, but difficult to manage due in part to the highly variable nature of blood pressure. However, just a few years ago, the definition of high blood pressure was lowered from 140/90 to 130/80 millimeters of mercury, and almost half of US adults suddenly had hypertension. This past October, a high-profile study showed that normal systolic pressure of just 120 millimeter of mercury actually carries a 39% higher risk for heart disease than systolic pressure of 100 millimeter of mercury. These recent results indicate that many more adults are at increased cardiovascular risk than what had been thought, and that they can do something about it. The upshot is that every adult would benefit from regular blood pressure monitoring. So here are the conventional methods for non-invasive measurement of blood pressure. Amongst these methods, oscillometry in the form of the automatic arm cuff device has emerged as the most widely used method by far. This 50-year-old technology is easiest to use, cheap, and closest in accuracy to the standard manual auscultatory method. However, as with all conventional methods, oscillometry requires an inflatable cuff and is not convenient enough to use or even inaccessible to those in low resource settings. As a result, only 55% of hypertensives worldwide and 40% of hypertensives in low resource settings are aware of their condition. And furthermore, an abysmal 10 to 20% of hypertensives have their blood pressure under control. If patients could regularly check their blood pressure, they may become more compliant in taking their meds. Because of the low hypertension awareness and control rates, high blood pressure is now the leading cause of disability-adjusted life years lost worldwide. For these reasons, many want to eliminate the cuff from blood pressure measurement, and cuffless blood pressure has indeed now become a field. Studies are increasingly appearing in the literature, and several wearable devices are now cleared by the FDA and other regulatory bodies. A comprehensive review of the flurry of activities can be found in a 2022 annual reviews paper. So most of the studies, and likely all of the regulatory cleared devices, employ pulse wave analysis with or without pulse arrival time. Pulse wave analysis methods typically measure a photoplethysmography or PPG waveform, which indicates distal blood volume oscillations, or a tonometry waveform, which indicates peripheral artery forces. Extract features from the waveform and map or calibrate these features to blood pressure values using machine learning. Pulse wave analysis with pulse arrival time methods also record an ECG waveform to extract pulse arrival time as the time delay between the ECG and hemodynamic waveforms, and possibly other features. Most methods require periodic blood pressure measurement with an arm cuff device as part of the calibration procedure, but some methods use only demographic information for less reliable calibration. However, these methods are not supported by generally accepted physiological principles. For example, here is a classic model of small artery viscoelasticity for relating changes in blood pressure to changes in PPG at the same measurement site. This model indicates that the PPG waveform is determined not only by blood pressure oscillations, but also by the elastic modulus and viscosity of the arterial wall. The elastic modulus here is well known to be modulated by arterial smooth muscle contraction and can thus vary completely independently of blood pressure. Here are data showing that as a consequence, changes in blood pressure induced by various interventions have little relationship with the induced changes in PPG amplitude. Pulse arrival time does stem from the theory of pulse transit time. This theory indicates that there is a tight relationship between blood pressure and the time delay between proximal and distal waveforms in the large elastic aorta. However, pulse arrival time is a crude approximation of aortic pulse transit time. It includes the heart's pre-ejection period, or PEP, in addition to the pulse transit time through small muscular arteries. The pre-ejection period, or PEP, can also vary independently of blood pressure. Here are data showing that while aortic pulse transit time correlates well with blood pressure, pulse arrival time tracks blood pressure poorly due to physiological variations in the pre-ejection period. Even so, numerous studies report that pulse wave analysis pulse arrival time methods are accurate. However, many or even most of these studies may be misleading. Firstly, results in published papers are often presented incorrectly. We performed computer studies to simulate cuffless blood pressure measurements with zero correlation to reference cuff blood pressure measurements, and then presented the results like many papers, as shown in gray. The results show impressive correlation of a cuff calibrated method with cuff blood pressure. However, when the data are presented correctly, as the change in the cuffless blood pressure relative to the calibration versus the change in cuff blood pressure relative to the calibration, we see the true lack of correlation. Most importantly, many studies do not include comparisons to fair baseline models. As described earlier, pulse wave analysis, pulse arrival time methods compute blood pressure from a hemodynamic measurement and non-waveform information, such as the cuff blood pressure for calibration, age, and BMI. It is well known that this other information correlates with blood pressure. The methods must therefore be compared to baseline models in which blood pressure is computed only from the non-waveform information. A cuffless device is not needed if its hemodynamic measurement does not offer added value over baseline models. Furthermore, a baseline model can seem accurate in a population, but surely can't help manage individual people since no measurement is being made. Also, studies of commercial devices are often performed with company involvement rather than independently. Such studies routinely show positive results. Here is an example of a demographic calibrated tonometry device against invasive blood pressure. The correlation is strong, especially considering that demographic calibration was employed. Here is another example of a cuff calibrated PPG device against 24-hour cuff blood pressure. The R-squared values are 0.95 to 0.99. R squared, not R. These results may be too good to be true. For example, cuff blood pressure measurements have significant error, and these levels of correlation are unprecedented in blood pressure measurement. So, in sum, despite regulatory clearance, the question remains, can these methods actually measure blood pressure? This past July, a Microsoft research team published perhaps the most comprehensive and highest resource study to date toward answering this question. They designed a practical yet informative study and included over 1,000 diverse subjects. They built wrist devices to measure PPG, tonometry, and ECG waveforms. They explored an array of machine learning algorithms to develop models for computing blood pressure from waveform features and non-waveform information, such as the cuff blood pressure measurement for calibration and the time of day. Yes, the time of day, to help with diurnal blood pressure changes. Crucially, they created fair baseline models to compute blood pressure from the non-waveform information alone. They found that the waveform feature models in green were only able to yield slightly lower blood pressure errors against a reference cuff device than the baseline models in purple. The results therefore indicate that pulse wave analysis, pulse arrival time methods offer essentially no value in blood pressure monitoring. The Microsoft research project should be regarded as an authoritative study of pulse wave analysis, pulse arrival time methods for the following reasons. An elite research team performed an unbiased study of cuffless blood pressure without financial or publishing concerns. The study cost millions of dollars. The study constituted an exhaustive assessment of methods with similarity to regulatory cleared devices. The team found that these methods offered no value in measuring blood pressure over fair baseline models. This means that they did not work at all. The team is offering their data for free to the public for others to verify. The team evidently quit cuffless blood pressure research following their study. And as an additional point, only clean waveforms were included in the study results, suggesting that improved wrist hand sensors are not the answer. All this said, the Microsoft research project may still not 100% prove that the commercial devices do not work. Last month, one of the first independent studies of a commercial device was published. A cuff-calibrated PPG device was assessed against 24-hour cuff blood pressure. Here are the participant average blood pressure measurements for the cuffless device in black and for the cuff device in gray for each hour of the day. These results are actually similar to the company's own publications. Common thinking is that the cuffless device works during the day, but not at night due to the inability to detect the nighttime dip. Alternative thinking is as follows. Firstly, the device does not work well at night. There is a modest dip after all. Secondly, the device may actually provide little value during the day or night. No comparisons with baseline models, such as the cuff blood pressure for calibration, were included here or elsewhere. And finally, the device could be trivially corrected here by always subtracting 15 millimeters of mercury from its blood pressure output at nighttime. In fact, just a few weeks later, a study of a similar cuff-calibrated PPG device was published, claiming to have solved the nighttime dipping problem. Here is an example from one study participant showing an accurately detected nighttime dip. And here are correlation plots of the nighttime dip of the cuffless device versus the cuff device. There's a lot to unpack here. Firstly, this was a retrospective analysis of data collected before the Microsoft research project was published. Secondly, the little correlation in the plots suggests the use of time of day or a silent accelerometer to trivially help determine average nighttime blood pressure over the subject cohort. I should also add that the authors neither described how they solved the nighttime dipping problem, nor made their data readily available for others to verify. Because of the lack of convincing validation data, the European Society of Hypertension maintains its recommendation that cuffless blood pressure measurement devices should not be used in clinical practice. A state of the field address would not be complete without at least mentioning that concepts for cuffless and calibration-free blood pressure monitoring have been proposed. None of these less investigated methods may be as convenient as pulse wave analysis, pulse arrival time devices, but they or other future methods might be the only way to obtain sufficient blood pressure accuracy without a cuff. In summary, the field of cuffless blood pressure can only be understood by taking a deep dive. Popular cuffless devices have not been proven to offer significant value in blood pressure measurement. More work is worthwhile and needed to realize the dream of cuffless blood pressure. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mukamara, for your excellent presentation again. So now I would like to give both of you an opportunity to ask each other a question or two. So first, Dr. Sola, do you have any question that you want to ask to Dr. Mukamara here?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Rama. Thank you, Gino. So, Rama, you did a very strong scientific statement on the fact that PPG amplitude techniques will be distorted by smooth muscle contraction, and that pulse transit time techniques will also be distorted by those, which I completely agree on both. It has been shown, and we have also shown this on our own group, that amplitude-based PPG will never work on the real life, and PTT will never work. Up to here, I completely agree on your statement. Then you kind of conclude that because Microsoft did one study in 1,000 patients and they found negative results, the cuffless blood pressure in general is just unsolvable, which I kind of disagree because there are many other reputable groups working in the field and companies that claim that has been solved. And they also presented data, which is at least important to be taken in account. So my question for you is, just for learning and to keep the discussion ongoing, and since you are one of the earlier pioneers in the field, in which direction do you think that the community should now go in a scientific, physiological, technical direction, so that for the next 5 years, you get the kind of data that you would like to see?
Dr. Sola, let me start off by thanking you for your leadership in the field of cuffless blood pressure. And thanks also for this thought-provoking question. But I first want to clarify my conclusion. The Microsoft research project was no doubt a huge blow to popular cuffless devices. It should also make us wonder how many other groups might have found similar results, but simply did not bother to publish them. This is common for negative findings. Someone gets a negative finding and doesn't bother publishing. But my conclusion is not just based on this project. My conclusion is also based on the fact that there are no convincing data in the public domain showing that pulse wave analysis and pulse arrival time devices, especially regulatory cleared ones, can provide significant value over baseline models. I'm not talking about a naive baseline model, but rather a fair baseline model. A baseline model should take all inputs that a cuffless device uses to predict blood pressure, except the hemodynamic measurements. This extra information could include the accelerometer, the time of day, the cuff for calibration, demographics. The model for computing blood pressure from the extra information should be as sophisticated and as thoroughly trained as the device's model for computing blood pressure. This is what fair means. A fair baseline model is necessary to determine if the pulse wave analysis pulse arrival time is of added value or not. Hence my conclusion, pulse wave analysis pulse arrival time devices have not been proven to offer significant value in blood pressure measurement, and why I maintain this conclusion even after seeing your final slides. If investigators are so confident that their pulse wave analysis pulse arrival time provides added value, then I encourage them to give the data to some independent person to verify. This is basically what Microsoft Research did. So now to your question. I think there are two important areas to focus on in cuffless blood pressure. One area concerns developing validation standards to ensure that only adequate devices are used to care for patients. This, of course, is the second topic of our session. The other area concerns establishing new cuffless blood pressure measurement principles. I'm not talking about new sensors and algorithms, but physiological measurement principles. Auscultation and oscillometry are examples of current measurement principles. This is a tall task for sure, but it might be the only way to completely replace the automatic cuff device.
So thank you, Dr. Mukamala, for your thoughts and answers. This time, Dr. Mukamala, do you want to ask any question to Dr. Sola?
Dr. Sola, do you want to ask do you have another question?
If I have time, yes.
Yeah, you
I
can.
don't know, Jano. Okay. So Rama, let me take over your last statement. So you conclude your statement and the presentation on that popular cuffless devices, they do not prove significant value. Okay, I see what you mean. Now, we don't think that the value of a cuffless device is to replicate what an oscillometric is doing, an oscillometric device is doing. What we do think, and going to my presentation, is that those devices, they need to monitor blood pressure and blood pressure changes, and they need to improve the engagement of the patients, and that's what's needed for hypertension management. And I think that Dr. Sergey will speak about this afterwards. So the thing is that blood pressure can be measured today with oscillometric devices, but it's not being measured. So that's why we are really trying to fill in this gap between perfect devices out there today, oscillometric devices, that can have very accurate measurements at each measurement itself, and the people out there that need to have their blood pressure being monitored day by day or week by week for the next 40 years. So think about the diabetes management thing is the same thing. So on the 2000 years, so 20 years ago, all the big companies, Microsoft and all the rest, all the biotech companies, they only were using finger sticks to measure glucose. Some startups just appeared and said, look, we could have continuous CGMs, continuous glucose monitor. And they were all like, it's not really accurate. Those devices, they needed to be calibrated. They were not as accurate as a finger stick. Still, they proved that they reduced accuracy, wherever this means, but they increased engagement. They managed to get better management of diabetics than the previous, in this case, oscillometric devices that we have here. So my question for you in this context, what do you think is the minimum testing? I'm not talking about lab testing. What's the minimum testing that cuffless devices should undergo? And with this, I'm saying, if you're going to tell me that they should be as accurate as an oscillometric cuff, I will tell you, okay, now show me that the oscillometric cuffs also have the engagement that a cuffless device will have. Show me that the cuff, which is absolutely precise, like an MRI for monitoring the heart, will be used by patients in their real life. So my question is, what lab or real world or clinical or usability testing do you think should be done on a cuffless device to prove that it has value for the management of hypertension?
Dr. Sola, this is a great question. And I'll tell you my personal view. I want to see that the cuffless device can help manage individual patients. As examples, it should be able to classify which patients undergoing 24-hour ambulatory monitoring have hypertension, and to classify which patients receiving treatment improve by at least one hypertension stage. The device rock AUC should be at least 0.8 to 0.9. No cuff recalibration during the test. For long-term impact on blood pressure control, where cuff recalibration may be required, the cuffless device has to be compared to a placebo device representing a fair baseline model. Those are my personal thoughts.
Great.
Let me ask you a question. So, Dr. Sola, one thing that you did not discuss is why pulse wave analysis devices should work. Behind every good method is a reason. Deep learning can classify images because the dog or cat or whatever is being classified is clearly in the image. An automatic cuff device likewise has strong theoretical basis. What is your theory to explain why PPG analysis can track blood pressure changes despite profound smooth muscle contraction? I'm not asking you to spill the beans on the specifics of PPG analysis, but just to give rationale on why we could trust these methods.
That's a fantastic one. Thank you. So I'm not going to talk about cats and dogs in an image, but so if I tell you, look, I'm going to put an arterial catheter in the ascending aorta. I'm going to record the pressure pulse, the pressure waveform of a newborn with a very elastic artery and very low blood pressure. And you show you that very smooth waveform. Now I take the same catheter and I place it on the ascending aorta of a very old, stiff, hypertensive patient. That one will be a very shapy, very short pulse. So in the central blood pressure waveforms, there is a lot of information of being hypotensive and very relaxed artery, or very hypertensive and very stiff artery. Now, in the middle, there are all the different steps. So if I was telling you that you could track the changes, so just take one patient with a particular waveform, and let's do a titration on that patient. Let's change his or her blood pressure. The waveform will move from the very hypertensive to the hypotensive. Will not be as clear as a newborn compared to an elderly, but there will be a change in there. So the central blood pressure waveform and all the information you can extract from that does contain information on whether that arterial tree, it's going into the hypertensive or hypotensive space. Now, all these Cuffless devices, we cannot afford to have a catheter in the ascending aorta. So we measure downstream. And we don't even measure invasively. We measure, in our case, with optical sensors. So the way these pulse wave analysis devices work, and that's the physiological principle, is that from the very raw optical signals, they move those signals into a signal space, where they contain the information from the central pulsatility that generated those signals. That's the kind of front-end signal processing step of all those algorithms. So they move from a raw PPG to a signal space where we could track the changes of central blood pressure. And from those changes, then there are different companies doing different things, different groups doing different things. From that central blood pressure changes thing, they extract the blood pressure given a calibration point. So to your point, the answer is all those, at least for those that I represent, all those devices and technologies, what they do is that they look at the changes of the waveform of someone who's moving from hyper to hypo or hypo to hypertensive status, and they track based on that information changing.
Thank you.
Welcome.
All right. Thank you very much for this interesting conversation. So now I would like to actually ask you, both of you, one question that I have. So this is related to some practical issues and challenges around the Cuffless blood pressure, and I also had got this challenge while I was working on the Cuffless blood pressure myself, but I didn't have a chance to rigorously address this challenge. So what I want to ask you about is related to this body posture and the sensor placement issues. So when it comes to the body posture, for example, if we think about the wristband type of devices, we all know that the hydrostatic pressure is a very well-known disturbance that can negatively impact the accuracy of Cuffless blood pressure. And also, besides the hydrostatic pressure, because of the body posture, when we place the Cuffless device, how tightly we place the device, to the body, is going to change the transmural pressure pertaining to the artery where we actually measure the blood pressure via the Cuffless method. And this hydrostatic pressure and transmural pressure can impact various types of Cuffless blood pressure devices. For example, when it comes to the PPG-based devices, these pressure changes can change the shape of the PPG signal, and that kind of a change in the PPG signal shape can potentially impact a lot of machine learning and deep learning analysis of a PPG signal, which are actually very hot and active in the recent literature. And besides the PPG signal itself, we know that these hydrostatic pressure and the transmural pressure changes, they can affect post-transit time and post-arrival time measurements because of the pressure changes. And I wonder how these kind of confounding factors, in Cuffless blood pressure monitoring can be addressed or overcome. So first, Dr. Sola, do you have any thoughts on that?
Me first? Okay. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. So I'm just taking on what I was saying before. Completely agree. If you measure locally the blood pressure at your wrist, just taking a cuff, so the local blood pressure, it will dramatically change depending on your body position and the arm position because of the effect of gravity. So the difference between the device and your heart will be different, so gravity will change the blood pressure. But this doesn't mean that the central blood pressure, the one at the left ventricle, will change. That one will not change. And the one that you want to diagnose is not, you don't want to diagnose someone to be hypertensive because it has very high arm blood pressure. You want to diagnose someone because it has brachial or kind of central high blood pressure. So yeah, hydrostatic changes of body position will have a strong effect on cuffs, and it will have a huge effect on the waveform of the PPG. Completely agree. I mean, everyone agrees, I think, here. Going back to what I was saying, what if the algorithms can take that raw PPG signal, which is very well affected by hydrostatic body position, blah, 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 all those things, and transform it into a space where it's capturing the central blood pressure information. That one, on that space, arm position will not have an effect. Any peripheral vasoconstriction effect will not have an effect on the estimation of blood pressure, and you will just get rid of any peripheral non-central brachial change in blood pressure. So my answer to you is this one. The algorithms that seem to be working the best today, to what we are screening and to our own knowledge, are those algorithms that they manage, not talking about machine learning, these are physiological algorithms. They manage to take the raw, whatever, PPG, autonometry, whatever it is, data, and transfer it into a space where we are tracking the changes of blood pressure, which are more central and not due to the peripheral effects.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Mukamura, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for this on-point question. We didn't really talk about it up to now. I think Dr. Sola, as a developer, will have really spent a lot of time on this problem. But, just a few things for me to say. Like, I also wanted to bring up that another practical problem is, especially for wrist PPG devices, is dark skin. It's something we didn't mention. It's been highly publicized. But in terms of like hydrostatic effect, as Dr. Sola said, if you have a wrist device and your hand's at heart level and you lower it to fully lower, the blood pressure increases by 40 millimeters of mercury or so, and the PPG waveform changes accordingly. And so I have a hard time understanding how you can distinguish that sort of change from an actual change to, in the PPG waveform due to systemic blood pressure. And I think some companies, like, it's really hard problems. And I think some companies, they will have the user keep the device at heart level and be still and take a measurement. And, that's to solve all this stuff. And there's some other automated devices. A lot of people think you can solve the problem fully with an accelerometer, and at a wrist or hand that's not correct, you can't fully solve it. You might be able to do some common sense things though. And yeah, probably for me, the best way to try to solve it would be another sensor.
Well, thank you very much. So in the interest of time, we have several questions from the audience. And so, if you don't mind, I want us to just go through the questions together and, answer the questions that we can answer at the moment. So I see this first question interesting. For example, what about hypotension? Are there any known limitations for detecting hypotension? Any thoughts from anyone? Yes.
I will, if I can step in. So from the physiological principle, these kind of technologies could work both for hyper and hypotensive. But there is one limitation, is that most hypotensive, so low pressure people, they have a very low skin perfusion. So the basic principle is that those optical sensors, they can capture the pulsatility of the arteries on the skin. Someone with very low, with a hypotensive attack, they will tend to have very low peripheral perfusion, so most of the PPG sensors will just capture noise. So that's my answer. Physiologically, it makes sense. From the sensing perspective, I don't think that one could deploy a device that can be used broadly for hypotension management.
Thank you, Dr. Sola. So the next question that I see is this: how has clinician feedback been incorporated into the development? Is it not clear how having so much data might influence the treatment plan? Does any speaker have any thoughts on this?
I think that's good for, Dr. Sola.
Yeah. Dr. Sola, go ahead.
I don't want to take all the discussion, but so it's correct. Our kind of devices, they are getting about 30 measurements per day and night per user, which is now we have about 100 million measurements out there in our servers. We cannot give this to physicians. They will never know what to do. To this question is that our job now, what we offer to the physicians is a summary of what's happening. A physician clinic has 200 subjects. They all keep wearing those cuffless devices. On their dashboard, what they see is once a week, they get a summary of saying, look, from these 200 subjects, these 20 are going out of control. Do you want to contact them? Do you want to titrate medication? Do you want to do anything? So that's the next level, which is not so much about science, it's more about engineering, is how to transform this lot of data into information that the clinic or the provider can use to treat the patient. And it's mainly a summarizing data science problem.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sola. Next question. So how does medication affect the accuracy of the Cuffless device? Dr. Mukamura, do you want to answer this question?
I mean, I think that it can have a great impact. You know, antihypertensives, they can work in various ways. I mean, there's diuretics, there's vasodilators, there's negative inotropes, and they actually all have different impacts on the PPG waveform, for example, but they all lower blood pressure. And so I think it's an extremely hard problem to solve, is to be able to detect blood pressure following treatment with a PPG signal alone.
Yeah, thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I suggest that the rest of the questions we just answer with text, and we will basically move on to the next session. So with that, I will hand the things over to Professor Health again.
Thank you very much, Professor Hahn. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the session chair, Dr. Christopher Scully. Dr. Scully is an assistant director in the Division of Biomedical Physics at the United States Federal Food and Drug Administration's Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories, also known as OSEL or OSEL, where he is also the program director of the Interoperability Research Program. In these roles, he leads a team of engineers and scientists performing regulatory science research to develop tools for advancing patient access to innovative, safe, and effective medical devices. He has served on multiple medical device standards committees, including the IEEE Committee for the Standard of Wearable Cuffless Blood Pressure Measuring Devices, of which we will hear a lot more in this session. Dr. Scully received his bachelor's degree in electromechanical engineering from Wentworth Institute of Technology, his master's degree in biomedical engineering from Stony Brook University, and a PhD degree in biomedical engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Dr. Scully, please.
Thank you, Professor Helt, and thank you all for joining us for the second half of the session on cuffless blood pressure measuring devices. During this half, we'll have two speakers discussing validation approaches and standards for cuffless blood pressure devices, followed by another Q&A session. So I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Alberto Avolio. Dr. Avolio is a professor emeritus at Macquarie Medical School in Sydney, Australia, and he's an internationally recognized in the field of cardiovascular hemodynamics with research experience related to pulsatile relationships between blood pressure and flow, characterization of pressure-dependent indices of vascular function, mechanisms of arterial stiffness, and many more. He has over 300 publications, a book, and 17 book chapters, and is an IEEE Fellow and Fellow of the International Academy of Medical and Biological Engineering. Currently, he's active in the area of cuffless blood pressure measurement devices and a member of the working group for the IEEE 1708 standard for cuffless blood pressure measurement devices, which he'll be presenting on today. So thank you, Dr. Avolio.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for the kind invitation. It's fantastic to speak at these sessions. I'm going to share my screen. So we've seen that this Cardiovascular Health Tech Conference is a forum for information to all the stakeholders, particularly in the cuffless blood pressure measurement devices. So my task is to talk about testing of these devices to the IEEE standard. Now, we know that there's a reason when we go to the supermarket and we buy a kilo of potatoes, we trust that we buy a kilo of potatoes, and that kilo is the same all the time. because that scale has been tested to the standard kilogram. So we take these standards for granted throughout daily life. And that engenders a sense of trust. Otherwise, the world could not function without a sense of trust in the operation, especially of machines, of the technical specifications and so on. So therefore, the idea of having standards, especially with medical devices, is actually quite different to the kilo of potatoes, because that standard is highly deterministic. There is a standard measurement that it develops. It's to do with metrology. Biology is different to the metrology element that we think of. So creating a standard for medical devices has got to do with understanding of the biological variations, and therefore to be able to specify the standard with that in mind. So, and we know that blood pressure standards have been around for a long time for cuff devices. And Dr. Sterigi, he's been part of these standards that we all use. When there was this idea to test cuffless devices, something else had to happen because those standards were not suitable. And so this standard was published by the IEEE. So the first one, 1708, was in 2014. And there's been an amendment which was published in 2019. So I'll talk about these. In fact, there's only one standard, which is the 1708. And I'll talk about what it is and the implication of these amendments. So the standard, there's a committee. This is the working group of the current one. I was not in the 2014 working group. This is the current one, which also includes some of the earlier members of the working group. And so the standard is constructed with a working group, and then it's approved by the IEEE Standards Board. And here is the Standards Board that approved from the IEEE. So it was approved in 14 and 19. And so the abstract of these standards, which is obviously the same for both, well, again, there's only one standard. I have to correct myself. There's one standard with amendments. So it establishes normative definition of what is a wearable cuffless blood pressure device. And the study, the standard is actually independent of the form of the device. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it doesn't use a cuff. That was the original definition. Or the vehicle to which the device is attached or which is embedded. It's applicable to all types of wearable blood pressure measurement devices, including these types of things, epidermal, unobtrusive BP devices with different forms of operation. Devices that measure short-term, long-term, snapshot, continuous, beat-to-beat, or variability. So this standard applies to these sorts of devices. And as I said, it's limited to evaluation of devices that do not use a cuff. And so the idea, of course, is to provide guidelines for manufacturers, but also to provide a published document that people can have to test devices such that it engenders a sense of trust, as it were, in the device. So just a few words about these amendments. So the amendments addressed the sample size. So as far as I'm concerned here, that standard, the original standard holds, and the amendments are modifications or enhancements to certain aspects. So one is increases the subject selection of the sample size, looks at variations in body position, addresses issues of motion artifact, and it provides a rationale for the support of sample size included in the standards to include some of these correlations between repeated measurements. So these are sort of technical aspects of the standard. And it clarifies the standards that are related to static testing or dynamic testing. Dynamic meaning changes in blood pressure. And it also incorporates these other aspects of, these performance parameters, as they're called in the standards, age, height, weight, and so on, when used in the calculation of blood pressure. So, and I suppose it also adds clarity to when additional testing may be needed. So specifically, we have here a procedure where, in fact, the proposal is that there are two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. The first phase includes 20 subjects, 20 participants. If it passes this phase 1, it goes on to phase 2. And the phase 2, which is the validation procedure, has 3 tests: a static test, the testing that would change in blood pressure, and test after the device is being calibrated. So these are done in phase 1. Phase 1, does it pass criteria? Yes, go back, and then continue with phase 2. And the difference between phase 1 and phase 2 is that you increase the number of subjects. And so the number of participants, totally 85, and it breaks it. So the standard breaks down these participants, especially in the ranges of hypertension. So one thing about that, the standard, it uses the JNC7 specification, which is the early specification of hypertension, 140 and 90, which dates back to 2003. But there is, and these were called pre-hypertension stage 1 and stage 2. So a breakdown of the hypertension levels, the blood pressure levels, and the number of subjects in phase 1 and phase 2. So evenly spread in this case. At least 26 males and 26 females, and the age should be 21 and 50. Now, this I highlighted this because I think this was in the original standard. With the amendments, this was qualified, and the qualification. So the phase 1, the pass criteria of phase 1 is 7 millimeters of mercury. So if 20 subjects pass those tests with a mean absolute difference of 7 millimeters of mercury, systolic and diastolic, the test can continue to phase 2. And all tests are to be analyzed separately. And so what the standard gives is a table which has accuracy level for the mean absolute difference in comparison to the previous standards of ANSI, AAMI, and the British Hypertension Society. So they give these breakdowns from less than 4 to over 7. Less than 4 pass, over 7 fail, and in between, mostly pass or fail, different grades, and so on. So this is an interesting situation. Does the device work or not? Is there these gray areas are possibly items of discussion. So just to describe these tests in a little bit more detail. So the static tests are simply testing the device against the sphygmomanometer. And so the various procedures, relaxing 10 minutes according to instructions. Test device is tested according to the instructions provided by the manufacturer. And a recalibration is allowed if a failed calibration occurs. So these are the specific procedures that should be followed. And then after the calibration, 3 pairs of measurements for each subject are done from the test and from the reference device, from the observed device. And so, and this is the problem here now. There is simultaneous or sequential measurements, depending on what it is that is being tested, because sometimes the inflation might actually, the cuff inflation might affect the test device. That was the first one. The second test is a blood pressure range test. So essentially, what the Cuffless, the original Cuffless standard, Cuffless blood pressure standard was saying was that, yes, the Cuffless device has to be tested against a normal sphygmomanometer. If it measures blood pressure, it should measure blood pressure the same way as a sphygmomanometer. But it should also detect changes in blood pressure. And what this test is doing is that it does not tell you what to do or how to get those blood pressure to change. Basically, it says whenever blood pressure changes, we want to see that the test device can detect those blood pressure changes. So, this test is to test whether the device has been properly calibrated, and validation protocol should require blood pressure data distributed around the blood pressure being measured at calibration. So these three pairs of measurements have to be done according to the methods and procedures inducing the blood pressure changes. So the methods are not restricted to the protocol. That's what I said. As long as the blood pressure changes and it's documented, it is tested. And so while the ranges of proportion should be in accordance with the requirement in table 2, and there's table 2. So what it says here is that the distribution of these changes should be more biased to the 0 to 15 and less to the 15 to 30, both ways, positive and negative. So the standard gives this type of distribution, but it does not specify how to achieve these measurements, these blood pressure changes. And then the third category of test is to test after a certain period of time, essentially to see how well it maintains its calibration. It doesn't say how long, which is fair enough because some of these devices have different times of calibration. So it's up to the discretion of the user, of the person testing the device, to make a decision. And this procedure is different from the in-use in the field, so that it different to the BHS protocol, which aims to subject the device to a period of fairly strenuous use. So in this case, it doesn't have to be stressed, as it were. It has to be subjected to a certain time period over which the calibration has to be tested. And so then to make a decision on the tolerable accuracy level during the period between the 2 points of the calibration. So again, 3 pairs of measurements for each subject also to be done. So some relevant clauses that came up in the amendments were the special patient population. So for example, remember I mentioned that in the 2014, the age range is 21 to 50. Here they're saying for those over 50, do it again. You have to do the similar tests with the proviso that additional tests with at least 20% of patients representing the upper decade for which the device is intended. And so here's an example: for 100 years, a study shall be conducted in patients, first of all, 21 to 50, and a separate study to be conducted in patients 50 to 100 with at least 20% of the patients between the last decade. That's what it means. So in the introduction here, the amendment changed this to 65 from a lower number. And so the 3 things to remember is that we need 85 patients, the device will pass at a mean error of 5 plus or minus standard deviation of 8 with those 3 tests. Now, that is a robust procedure to test devices, because what the standard says, as I repeat, is that we want to see that at least the device replicates the sphygmomanometer, that it can detect changes in blood pressure, doesn't matter how they've been caused, and that it can maintain its calibration. And the biological variability of the whole measurement aspect of blood pressure is inherent in the precision, in the error magnitude of 5 and the precision of the measurement of plus or minus 8. And so far, with these cuff-based measurement, these standards have been extremely useful because they're devices that use these these limits become useful in diagnosing and treating hypertension. So what the standard is saying, if we have a device that claims to measure blood pressure without using a cuff, we should test them according to these prescriptions. So in summary, the standard says the validation team should consist of 2 properly trained observers and 1 engineer of the manufacturer, if is necessary. Training the observers to be able to measure blood pressure accurately with a cuff, they've got to be trained. Phase 1, as we said, 20, phase 2, 65. And the amendment also says that there could be a way to test the correlation from of measurements between phase 1 and phase 2. And so again, these are the 3 tests: static, blood pressure change, and calibration after a certain time. Now, if one goes to this website, which is public website, one can see which standards are recognized by the FDA, consensus standards. Amongst these standards is a 1708. And at the moment, the FDA has given it partial recognition. Partial recognition, and they say which clauses are partly recognized and those that are. And so they list the clauses here. And so here, the rationale. So what they're saying is that they think the standard is very good, it's relevant for medical devices, and it is recognized on its scientific and technical merit, and it supports existing regulatory policies. So it is not recognized because clause 4.2 and so on does not provide measurement or specifications that result in valid measurements, and it conflicts with another clause on the ISO standard. It doesn't deal with special populations with non-preeclamptic pregnancies. And it does not provide requirements on the induced blood pressure changes. It also does not provide statistical justification of the proposed acceptance criterion, and it does not provide specific risk management for wireless technologies that are used for radio frequency wireless technology medical devices. So, and then it says, if you want to test this device, please contact the FDA regarding the use of the device prior to using the standard to support claims for use of during patient transport, ambulatory monitoring, motion artifact, stress or exercise testing. So this is the current situation. And the other current situation is the working group is working literally as we speak to address these concerns to hopefully obtain total recognition. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Volio. Just a reminder, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So I'll introduce our next speaker now, Dr. George Sturgio, Professor of Medicine and Hypertension at the University of Athens. Dr. Sturgio is a leader in many international hypertension organizations, including chairman of the STRIDE BP International Organization on Blood Pressure Measurement Methodology and Technology, Secretary of the International Society for Hypertension, Special Envoy for Blood Pressure Measurement to the World Hypertension League, and Executive Committee member on blood pressure monitoring equipment. He's also an ISO committee member on blood pressure monitoring equipment and has published 390 articles with 58,000 citations in the research areas of blood pressure monitoring technology, hypertension diagnostics, epidemiology, pediatric hypertension, and antihypertensive drug action. Dr. Sturgio will be discussing validation approaches from the clinical perspective. Thank you, Dr. Sturgio.
Thank you for the invitation to contribute to this engineering meeting. And I'd like to start with Stefan Hales, who was not an engineer. He was not a doctor. He was a clergyman, a priest in England, and he was the first who did these famous experiments. He observed the dynamic behavior of blood pressure by putting a glass column in the artery of a horse. And this guy was also not an engineer, who was a clinician in Italy, and then another doctor, a surgeon in Russia, they invented the cuff auscultatory blood pressure measurement method, which is still here after longer than a century. It has been regarded as the most important step in measurement. This is the reason we have the whole chapter of clinical hypertension, this kind of measurement, but also by adopting this method, we neglected the dynamic behavior of the circulation and focused on snapshot information of blood pressure. This is not by a priest or a doctor, this is probably by engineers, and this is the oscillometric method, which has been developed to have all the good and bad things of auscultator. It's not perfect because it had to be the same as the manual auscultatory method. And this is where we are here in clinical medicine. We still have office measurements. We have home measurements by patients. We have ambulatory measurements. We tend to promote automated devices for all these measurements, which are supposed to give the same numbers as manual auscultatory. And all these methods take only snapshot information of the dynamic 24-hour profile of blood pressure. So the Cuffless measurement, and I'm glad that my friends engineers presented so nicely the problem we have with hypertension in the general population as a risk factor and its management. Ideally, having a wearable device will give us all the information, not snapshot information. It will give us the full behavior of the individual blood pressure through time. We believe that these blood pressure values should reflect organ damage and cardiovascular disease more accurate than the snapshot blood pressure data we currently obtain. And another aspect of cuffless devices is that if they are implemented in mobile phones, automatically each person who has a mobile phone has a blood pressure monitor. So it will allow to increase the awareness and early diagnosis of hypertension in the general population. So indeed, we as a medical profession believe that these technologies can really change all what we do for hypertension. It can change screening. We have a lot of undiagnosed hypertensives at no cost for the healthcare system, because the users are going to buy these devices. It can help the diagnosis because they are going to give us a lot more accurate information. All this story with office and out-of-office measurements, all these fake phenomena of white coat and mask hypertension, they are only products of cutting the blood pressure profile into pieces. And it can help with monitoring of treatment because we have a complete and unbiased information, and really it has the potential to improve long-term adherence with blood treatment and improve blood pressure control. And you know better, much better, of all these different technologies. And it's interesting that these are so different among them. They can be continuous, they can be intermittent, they can be automated or manual, cuff calibrated or demographic calibrated or calibration free, or they might be wearable or may operate or not at heart level. This is what my friends engineers had taught me. But these all things are different scenarios also for us in the clinical setting. And we have been very proud in 2018 when we managed at last, Americans, Europeans, and ISO to sit at the same table, have universal standard. And as soon as we finished that, we realized that this is almost useless for all these strange and attractive cuffless devices. So I'd like to give you what you know, but maybe put a little more emphasis on why we need such things in our routine clinical practice. What we do is we do the classic measurements. We use the manual auscultatory devices, or we prefer the automated arm cuff blood pressure devices, which are supposed to give the same values. We take standardized readings after 5 minutes rest and 2 or 3 readings in the sitting position. And we use these numbers to classify people, to label people. And we use thresholds which have been defined by using only this method, cuff arm blood pressure measurement, manual auscultatory or oscillometric. We also have assessment out of the office. We today believe that 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure measurement is not perfect, but this is the best method we have for diagnosing hypertension. We use it for 24 hours because it gives us a lot of information of what each individual does, his blood pressure behaves during the day, and there are so many unpredicted differences. And we also look at night. Nighttime blood pressure probably is the most important aspect of blood pressure behavior in terms of its prediction of future cardiovascular risk. And then we treat. And this is serious because we reduce blood pressure and we prescribe drugs not for 1 day or for 1 week. Who cares about any treatment for 1 week? But for lifetime. It might be 1 drug, 2 drugs, 3 drugs, 4 drugs. All blood pressure clinics have a lot of patients of 4 or 5 drugs. And these decisions for lifetime treatment are based on these measurements. And then we target a specific blood pressure level, which is the level which will prevent the most of cardiovascular risk to our patients. And we follow these patients in the long term. We ask them to self-monitor their blood pressure at home for months, years, because we know that long-term blood pressure control is what will bring the cardiovascular disease prevention to the patients. So having said that, whatever standard any device might pass, whatever clearance it might pass, the clinician will try to test it whether it works for each daily job. So if you go to one step here, office blood pressure measurement, normally you'd like to compare in a static test versus the standard. This is the standard. This is how we develop the thresholds for starting treatment, for diagnosing, for treating to the goal. But we realize that this static test, particularly for cuff calibrated devices, immediately post-calibration are useless because this experiment is designed to keep blood pressure stable. And if a device replicates all the time the calibration blood pressure, it will pass. And of course, it was interesting that you covered in discussion the position tests for some devices, which are measured in more than one positions, and they will certainly need to be tested for their behavior in these different positions. ABPM is a great test. It has been very well studied in terms of short studies and long studies, is the best predictor of prognosis. Of course, if you use it as a comparator, you have the problem that your comparator is an oscillometric device. And these devices are not identical. But you can look at the wake asleep blood pressure difference. And if you take that as your endpoint primary measure, it can be a very powerful test for tracking blood pressure changes. And the most clinically relevant test is this one, because this is why we care about hypertension, because we want to lower blood pressure. So if you calibrate before treatment, reduce blood pressure with treatment, and then validate, you can see whether this device can work for you to track what you wanted to do to change blood pressure. And of course, because we follow people for a long time to see if optimal blood pressure control is maintained, we have to check whether the accuracy is maintained in the long term during recalibration periods. We discussed a lot, and Professor Avolio discussed about laboratory studies, very interesting experimental studies, and several of you have done that in your lab, increasing, decreasing blood pressure. And this is the most tricky part of this validation. And this is a very big challenge for us, because the validation studies have always been observational studies, but now we have to make them interventional studies because we need to track blood pressure changes. We didn't have this problem before. And this, particularly when we try to increase blood pressure, might impose risk to some of our patients. And the way, the protocol, the procedure we use must be reproducible and standardized, very well defined. And there are several published ways to change blood pressure, increase, decrease blood pressure. But for the clinical setting, in my clinic to do a study, I can't do experimental work in a clinical validation. I remind you that so far, the ISO has used only the bicycle in its validation tests. Maybe it will not work for all devices, but should be our basis in starting considering how to increase blood pressure for tracking blood pressure changes. But for us, clinical field studies is the most important because this is the ultimate proof that the device works for our patients. And these are pragmatic evaluations of clinically relevant blood pressure changes, the changes we try to make and follow in our practice. So if you do the ABPM and track usual daily activities and sleep, this would be perfect for wearable devices versus ABPM, but of course you have to compare not the absolute blood pressure values, but only the day, night, awake, asleep blood pressure change. And if you treat patients, you calibrate before treating and validate after several days or week when you expect blood pressure to be changed. In some of them, it's unpredictable to patients. This can be a very powerful test and very clinically relevant, having manual auscultatory as reference. So the key elements of validation are that manual auscultatory must be the reference for devices used for clinical hypertension diagnosis and management. The validation post-calibration probably is relevant mainly for non-calibrated cuffless devices. Tracking blood pressure changes is the key problem. Position motion tests we discussed are important for some devices, and stability over time is also important. But deciding how to test one of the devices, we have to see whether it's wearable, whether it's cuff calibrated, or demographics, whether it's automated or continuous, and hug level, and then which device we decide which tests will fit and are necessary for this kind of device type. So these gentlemen look the same, but they need different treatment. And going to the end, I have to say that the tests have to be clinically relevant. They have to be pragmatic rather than experimental. As much as possible, the validation studies should be observational tests rather than interventional, posing potential risk to our patients. They have to be acceptable and safe for our patient. If you design the perfect experiment, but patients do not accept to do it, it will be a problem. And they have to be applicable in many research centers. With all these devices available on the market, you can't deal that with 5 centers around the world. So I'd like to close here with the statement by the European Society of Hypertension last year, I think still applies. No question, these devices have considerable potential to change the diagnosis and the management of hypertension, but we still have fundamental questions regarding their accuracy, their performance, and their implementation. And all these have to be carefully addressed before they can be recommended for clinical use. Being the only clinician in this meeting, you often realize that we use the same words in a different meeting, but I think engineers, clinicians can eventually work together, as we have done so many times in the past, and get this done. But not today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sturgio. So we'll now switch over to the question and answer portion of this session. And to start off, Dr. Sturgio, I'll ask if you have a question for Professor Bolio that you would like to ask.
Yes, I have a question which is really a problem for me. I think you have taught us, and we found after you, that indeed the tracking blood pressure changes is the most important problem and the most difficult one. So we have fast blood pressure changes in the lab, and we have long-term blood pressure changes awake, asleep, or after treatment, after a few weeks. And also we have blood pressure changes and experiments to increase blood pressure and others to decrease blood pressure. Do we need to do all of them? Can I extrapolate and say, as the device can track increasing blood pressure, it will do well with decrease. As it can track a fast blood pressure change, it will track also the long term. That's my question.
Sorry, I was muted. So I think for practical purposes, it sounds like common sense. But as we know, especially the relationship of waveform changes and intra-arterial blood pressure is actually nonlinear. The arteries have a nonlinear stress-strain curve, so that the response of the stress and strain on the vessels. Remember, the origin of blood pressure is the tension in the wall, and that tension, and the tension relation of blood pressure is nonlinear, which means that the proportion of change when the pressure decreases is not the same as when it increases. Now, so that's the first thing. But directionally, yes, if a device can track a decrease, most likely it should, if it works properly, should track an increase. But especially with PPG devices, it depends on what it is that is causing that change in the waveform. An alpha blocker will increase blood pressure, but most likely reduce the PPG signal energy because of the vasoconstrictor effect. An increase in stroke volume will increase the blood pressure, the same as the alpha blocker, but alpha agonist, sorry, but it would increase the pulsatile energy in the PPG. So it depends on what it is that is causing the blood pressure. And so, George, you're saying that the tests should be clinically valid, and that's true. That's true. If we have an increase in pressure due to an increase in arterial volume, plasma volume, that's different to a vasoconstrictor effect, and vice versa with vasodilators. So, but I go back to the standard that I presented. I said that, in fact, it's quite a robust document. What it says is that within this range, plus or minus 30, you should be able to detect those changes. Now, irrespective of how you do it, because it depends on how the device works. I don't think the standard should prescribe what to do about the device. It should say that if you claim you can measure blood pressure, show me that you can test it within physiological limits. So I think yes, maybe there should be a difference in the ranges. I don't know if it should be an equal range plus or minus different. I'm not sure. But what's more relevant? To test it at low blood pressure or test it at high blood pressure? Do you want to diagnose a hypertension when it's high, or do you want to make sure that it's treated? You're treating the patient and it can detect the low one. The response of treatment is decrease in blood pressure for sure. What happens if the treatment isn't working? It's going to increase. So you still need both.
If I could respond to that, when I read first time the IEEE protocol, I said, who wrote this? This is crazy. Nobody can do that, because it's so much more complex than what we used to do for validating oscillometric devices. And considering what you just said, it seems that we can't find a simple way to a simple protocol, an easy protocol. It will take a lot to test these devices. Unfortunately, there is no shortcut for testing these properly and making sure that they can be clinically useful unless we do quite a lot of work for each one of them.
But what you suggested is quite reasonable. Use the field data in patients. There are maneuvers that one can do. I suppose Valsalva, obviously it's a decrease. It favors a decrease in blood pressure. But I think a good compromise would be just as to use the field data that is available with treatment, so that at least you have a control, which is high, goes down. Can you track that treatment response? I don't know. Going a few steps when these protocols that people use to change blood pressure within certain limits. Safety was a problem, of course, and I suppose that's the regulatory authorities would question that to make sure that the tests are safe. But I mean, that is something a bit more. It's a different area to saying what tests need to be provided such that the device is validated. And go back to the trust. How can you as a physician trust the device that actually works? How do you do that? What is required for you to say, I'm going to use this device in my patient? And I think what the industry would like to see is that very thing. What do you want the device to show you such that you can use it in your patients?
Thank you. I'll ask a question for both of you now, and probably Professor Volio, maybe you can go first. So both of you discussed the approaches for validating cuffless blood pressure devices. As was discussed during the first session, there are many different designs being developed for these types of devices, different types of sensors, demographic inputs, models that are being formed, which can all introduce different anatomical or physiologic factors that may influence the measurement error. And this may vary between the technologies. So how do the testing methods consider these differences, and how can studies be designed to identify important demographic factors for the technology being tested and understand if it's going to be beneficial for all patients, or what the performance differences may be for those different populations?
And I think as George said, it's a very difficult area. And I go back to what I was saying before, that if, depending on what the what is the sensor, if the sensor is the PPG, a test that is testing, for example, waveform or transit time, that has a lower sensitivity. For example, a cold pressor test could show an increase in blood pressure, but little change in transit time. Whereas an exercise test could show the same change in blood pressure, but a marked change in transit time. Now, why is that? Is that because the physiological response is different, or that what is being measured is not detecting that blood pressure effect? And this is the problem in terms of identifying. So that standard, the 2014 standard, said that doesn't depend on how the device is embedded, how the sensor is embedded in the device, is that whatever it is, the sensor should be able to compensate or deliver that measurement. So this is could be under discussion. Do these standards have to be prescriptive at the type of device? So you need a different standard for a different device? I'm not sure. So the question is, Chris, I'm not sure we can answer this without going into do we need different standards, as I said. But I think it should be thought out. It should be thought out. And maybe we could look at some of these categories of devices, that whether it's the maybe the manufacturer will have to specify what it is that is being analyzed here. Is it the waveform, transit time, and so maybe to look at these subcategories. But I think these are things that have to be discussed in these working groups and standards committees for sure.
So if I could add a comment here, I had to remind you again that I'm a doctor, which means that whenever we talk about PPG or whatever, I have very little understanding of what exactly it is. And on the other hand, whenever you give me a device, I have no idea what is in. So what is important for me is how it's going to be used. Do I have to calibrate it? It's another thing. Is it wearable? Is it automated or manual? I think these features inevitably require different testing. So in my understanding, we have to make groups of devices according not to their internal principles and technology, but in how they can be used: calibration, automated, wearable, heart level, these things. And inevitably, some tests do not fit for some of them, but fit to others. So we'll probably come out with a combination of tests depending on the combination of features in the clinical setting.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to some questions from the audience now. First one, a little separate, moving away from the kind of change test perspective, for a calibration-free snapshot device, so that both the change test and test after a certain period of time necessary if there is no calibration point. And maybe this is from the clinical perspective as well as what the standards currently say about this. So it's for a calibration-free device, what do we expect for the period of time being evaluated?
Alberto, there is silence.
I think Rama. Rama, what do you think?
If I talk, I'll say what Rama told me. So Rama, you have to talk. And I'll support.
I mean, I would say, yeah, I didn't know I was participating in this,
Oh,
but I would say that if the device operates like a automatic arm cuff device and doesn't take any other input but the measurement, then it should undergo the same validation standard as an automatic arm cuff device and need not be tested for changes. That's just my opinion.
I think this is quite tricky for several people, and it was for me, because we say cuffless devices, we drop it in the basket of cuffless devices, but this device, we don't care how to work. It works without any information. So it might not need all the complexity of, it might not have issues with blood pressure changes. That's the key.
But is there maybe there should be some specific indication of what the device is used for? Is there something like a specification of the device? Is that relevant? Or all these devices therefore should be the same, whether they're calibrated or uncalibrated? Eventually, they are cuffless blood pressure devices. Now, are there subcategories in that? And maybe Josip can help here, just involving the other
Thank
speakers.
you, Alberto. I was waiting to be allowed to talk. All right. So I think that's a very good question. So everything that we covered since we started today is on the use and the validation of cuffless devices that need to be calibrated. On that context, it absolutely makes sense to ask the questions we're asking. Do we need to validate the tracking changes, calibration stability, all those kind of things? Absolutely right. Now we're going to another topic. What about a cuffless device that does not need to be calibrated? So it's kind of a Markovian device. It's a device that whenever you use it, it's accurate, exactly as an oscillometric cuff. So here I would join Rama's thought, is that if a device can claim that can be used on anyone at any time without calibration, there is no, in principle, need to test that it can track blood pressure changes because it already covers, it's like an oscillometric device. So if now we were going into cuffless, non-calibrated devices to be tested also for BP changes, this opens the door to, okay, so let's also test oscillometric devices, how well they can track BP changes that we never did. Happy to do that. And to open that door, I don't think that the standard committees would agree. But in principle, if you want to treat fairly the cuffless devices that do not need to be calibrated, they should not be tested for BP changes. In the same way that oscillometric devices, they are not validated for BP changes. That's my thought.
I would just want to say, when we say calibration, to me, I'm talking about either cuff calibrated or demographic calibrated. In either case, they should undergo change testing. Calibration free means only the measurement is used, just like an automatic cuff device.
But the difference there is, Josip, is that the cuff devices actually measure a pressure, whereas the cuffless devices don't. They measure a cuff pressure, and that cuff pressure is actually very accurate. It's the surrogate association with arterial pressure, which is the problem. The measure, whereas the other one, there's no measurement there. And this is the difference. There's no physical measurement of any force related, in most anyway.
I completely agree, Alberto.
Thank you.
Chat or discussions.
Move on to another question from the chat. So there's a question about error grid plots, and similar to continuous glucose monitors, there's been error grid analysis proposed for arterial pressure method comparison studies. And do we expect to see that type of analysis in the standards anytime soon?
I'm not sure, George. I don't think so. I'm not aware
Joseph,
of that.
Thank you, Chris. So the current standard, so the ISO 81061 OXISO-2, was developed several decades ago for CAF, so oscillometric validation of oscillometric devices. And these standards and the IEEE is kind of the same. They are based on accuracy and precision. So I agree with you, George and Alberto. I don't think that those standards will not be revisited soon to go into other ways of validating. Now, I think it's a very valid question. Should we start envisioning that for new kind of devices, like the cuffless devices, should we start categorizing them not based only on accuracy and precision, but on how accurate and precise they are across different ranges of blood pressure? Having an error of 10 millimeters of mercury on someone who is at 190 will probably have less impact on the treatment on an error of 10 of someone who is at 125. So the precision and accuracy that you need at different ranges, and that's the spirit behind this error risk grids, is that should we allow for larger precision on regions where it's less important to be precise? I think it's an important question to be asked.
The answer is yes and no. It's true that if blood pressure is 200 or 180, you're going to treat. But if you have acute stroke, for example, you should not reduce blood pressure very aggressively. And then you need accuracy at high levels because you can do damage if you go fast.
Mm-hmm.
So you need accuracy across the range.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what about?
Sorry, there is another thing that I would like to say, that there is a discussion that okay, this device is not for clinical decisions. It's like these things we wear. They measure steps and heart rate. It's not. Any measurement for me has to be accurate because it can mislead somebody. It can reassure him that it's fine, or he can unnecessarily direct him to the healthcare professional. I think all devices have displaying blood pressure measurements should have accuracy and across the blood pressure range. It's not only hypertension, it's hypotension, it's shock, it's acute care, it is emergencies. We need we rely on these numbers. They change what we do.
Thank you, Dr. Sturgio. It's about 10 after the hour now, so I am going to pass it back, or pass it to, not back to Dr. Professor, excuse me, Kumhala to close out the session. Thank you both for your presentations today and the discussion.
Let me close it out. Dr. Helt had an emergency. We want to thank everyone for the great discussion that can help move the challenging field of cuffless blood pressure forward. Video recording information for this session will be provided to you in an email soon, and very much hope to see you all tomorrow at 9 a.m. US Eastern to discuss congestive heart failure monitoring. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Right.
Thank you very much.